RealTalk USA.
It's my house, come on, turn it up.
Hello everyone, this is RealTalk USA and I'm Sisai Wubshat filling in for AUL. I have here Chris and Meth with me. Hi Chris, Meth.
Sisai, very nice to meet you.
Very nice.
Did I get your name right?
Yeah, you're right.
So we're going through a lottery of hosts over the past couple of weeks, but I believe that you will be back with us. He's finishing up his vacation.
Yeah.
Yes,
and his
tomorrow,
IVLP tomorrow. So
Yeah.
he may. We don't know when we'll run this. We're actually running it this Thursday. Yes.
Yes,
So
yes.
he should be back by the time the next show will run.
Next show will run,
Yep.
possibly.
That's none of that is to say that we're not pleased to meet you, Sisai. And
I was thinking that you would like me more than you want me to stay here.
We'll see. We'll see.
we'll see.
Yeah.
Look, why not? You know, but I hear you have another job anyways over.
But if you treat me well, then I might change.
Okay, well, we'll try not to be too hard on you. Make you like it. It's very nice to meet you. Thanks for filling in.
You're most welcome. And what is today's topic?
Today's topic is PEPFAR, and we are privileged to have as a guest Lolem Ngong, who is our U.S. Embassy to Ethiopia's PEPFAR Coordinator. Lolem, it's nice to meet you formally
nice
as well.
to meet you formally. Nice to meet you, Sisai.
Nice to meet you.
You know, I've seen you around at the embassy. I've been here since August of last year, and you've been here for 2 years now.
2 whole years.
But
2 years and 1 month.
2 years and 1 month. Not
Yes.
that you're counting. Not that you're counting.
No one's counting, but yes.
No, it's funny. I mean, look. I mean, the way the lives of diplomats, it's sort of when you get towards the end of your assignment, whether it's 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, you just sort of begin to count, right?
Yes.
And it's just I know psychologically, if you know you're in it for 4 years, you know you're in it for 1 year, your brain does that adjustment.
Yes,
But
yes.
so, not a commentary on Ethiopia or anything.
No,
like that.
no, not at all, not at all. Just looking forward to the end of an assignment and, to other things.
So before we get into actually what we have you on here for, you're going back to D.C.
Yes,
and you're from Georgia.
I'm from Georgia.
And
Originally from Cameroon. I forgot to add that.
oh,
Yes.
Okay, that's
See?
kind of interesting. So another are you naturalized
Yes,
citizen?
yes.
Okay. Well, that's great to know as well.
Yes.
And so can we talk about your transitioning? You're going back to Washington, but you've been U.S. Embassy's PEPFAR Coordinator here for the last couple of years. Can you tell us a little bit about what is PEPFAR?
So PEPFAR is the U.S. President's emergency plan for AIDS relief. It was started in 2003 under President George W. Bush and has enjoyed congressional support from both parties for the past 15 years. One thing to note this year, since I said 15 years, this year we're celebrating 15, 1 5.
2003.
Since 2003. So we're actually celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we're doing a lot of activities which we will start rolling out in December around World AIDS Day. Okay. Really proud of our accomplishments globally. PEPFAR is an $80 billion program from 2003, so cumulative. Budget,
how much?
80 billion.
Wow. Okay.
Which has provided support to about 53 countries. 27 of those countries are on the African continent. And so we have programs like this, like the one we provided support in Ethiopia, in 27 of these African countries.
Wow.
Yes.
So, the reason it shocked me, always shocks me to hear how old I am. And I can't.
You don't look old, Chris.
I remember back in the day when PEPFAR was rolled out, and we were in the middle of Iraq, and we had all these controversies.
This is actually true. Yes, you're absolutely right.
We went into Iraq, and I'm a former Marine, so that's why that.
The reference.
Like, so it's 15 years. Wow, that's incredible.
And time goes by.
So, look, PEPFAR is aging well, though.
It's aging very well.
And you said something interesting, and we know this, highlight for our audience, like, what's really interesting about PEPFAR, and after PEPFAR, YALI, for example, Young African Leaders Initiative, which we just concluded our recruitment, the deadline ended things like AGOA,
Yeah.
is that you've had President George W. Bush, who had 2 terms, and then you had President Obama, who had 2 terms.
Right.
And we're in the middle of President Trump's first term.
Right.
We won't get into whether there will be 2 terms there or not.
No, we will not.
Not getting there. But 3 very different presidents, all committed to this program. Can you
Yes.
talk a little bit about why is that the case? I mean,
Sure.
it could sound strange to someone who's not really.
Sure,
making that
absolutely. I mean, I think that the cases, I mean, one, I think is just basic humanity. I mean, this is a program that started when, at the time, the HIV epidemic was really out of control, if you will, for lack of a better description.
Where?
And particularly on the African continent, but really all over the world. And, you know, at the time, I mean, the U.S. had its huge wave of the HIV crisis in the 80s into the early 90s. And then we started seeing this really huge explosion around the African continent without us really having enough information on what to do, where to start, and not even having any organized mechanisms to fund access to basic interventions, even something as basic as providing condoms. And at the time, you know, an HIV diagnosis to anyone was really a death sentence because there was no treatment. There was people didn't know what it, I mean, we really didn't have an accurate.
A lot of misinformation.
Right. And so I think just basic humanity, when you see people dying, you see children dying, you see pregnant women infected, not knowing they're infected and passing on that infection to a child, I think. And then people knew people, whether it was within their family or within their friend circle or, you know, whatever, who were infected with HIV. And so I think it's just basic humanity, and I think it's just a basic responsibility that each one of us has, not only to our community, but also to the global community. And I mean, I would argue...
So it's interesting because... you know, I mean, that's exactly George W. Bush, conservative Republican.
Yes, yes, very much so.
His base are very religious people, but yet there was this initiative, which does strike at, like, the compassion that the average American has for in this area.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think as the program was implemented and grew over the years, we started seeing results. So we knew there was a lot that was possible.
The compassion gets you only so far, but it's got to be successful.
Right. And so you started seeing people live longer. You started seeing better health infrastructure. You started seeing people being able to talk about being HIV positive. Not to say that we've done away completely with stigma. There is still stigma associated with the disease. But at the very least, you have people who can talk openly about the disease. I mean, for us to know, I mean, in the States at the time, we already knew our celebrity who was very outspoken was Magic Johnson. And then, for example, on the African continent, the
Magic
first
Johnson,
person...
most people may know who he is, but he's a famous
basketball player. Yes. And
his first name is not really Magic.
Irvin, right?
Irvin, yeah.
Irvin. I should know this because I am actually a Lakers
He's so good on the
fan.
court. Yeah, he's so good on the court. They got him in Magic.
And so on the African continent, we didn't really have that poster child or that spokesperson, if you will. But you know, when you start seeing progress, not only in the way people are living, on, you know, once they start taking treatment, but then, you know, for people to openly talk about it, like we knew Brenda Fassie, this famous South African musician, died of AIDS. I mean, I bet if we didn't have this kind of progress, we wouldn't know. I mean, people would say, oh, she died of cancer, or so on. So you start seeing results, you start seeing community involvement. I mean, civil society got on the bandwagon, governments took leadership, you know, private companies became involved. And so when you see those kinds of results, it only begs for you to continue supporting programs like this. And, you know, what I really like about PEPFAR, not necessarily because I work with PEPFAR,
You are.
but
You are
so this is a bias, yes. What I really like is that, within countries, it's a partnership, right? This is not a program that is, the U.S. government coming in and running a program and imposing. There is a shared partnership. We value what civil society says. We value what the government says. We value what other major donors say. We value what our UN family says. So it's good to enjoy that type of partnership in helping us reach our goals, or in helping host country governments reach their goals.
So you have been working here with the U.S. mission to Ethiopia. So can you talk a little bit about what does HIV/AIDS look like in Ethiopia?
Sure. So, Ethiopia, I think, is in a really sweet spot because it's one of the countries that. So let me first give a little bit of background. When PEPFAR started supporting Ethiopia in 2004. And at the time, and from then, PEPFAR supported Ethiopia. The budget, has increased over time. Then it started declining, which is a sour spot. But overall, Ethiopia is in a really good position because of all the support that has been provided to the country and all the work that we've done with the government, specifically with the Ministry of Health and also with the AIDS control program. Ethiopia's prevalence is somewhere right under 1%, which a lot of countries have not enjoyed that. So just to give you an idea, in East Africa, the range is about, maybe Ethiopia I think Ethiopia now is at 0.9% to about like 4% in Kenya, or 3 point something in Kenya. And then you go to like the southern part of the continent and you start seeing unbelievable percentages, like 12%, or Eswatini at 25% or 26%. Yes.
Eswatini?
So what this means is that 1 in 4 persons are HIV positive. Wow. So you think of that, and then think of Ethiopia's situation at under 1%. And Ethiopia is in a really good place to control the epidemic. So when we look at, for example, the UNAIDS strategy, which is a global strategy that we fully support, which is that 90% of persons who are HIV positive should know that they're HIV positive. Of those 90% who know that they're HIV positive, they must have access to life-saving treatment. And of those 90%, we want to make sure that their viral load the virus is suppressed, which helps them reduce transmission.
What is viral suppression?
Right. So viral suppression is basically a measurement of to simplify it, it's a quantification of the virus in one's body. So if your viral load is very high, so and I forget the units now, if it's very high in your system, then you're at a higher risk for transitioning to AIDS, right? From going from HIV to AIDS, which then it's a bit harder to treat, because as we know, there is no cure. If you have a lower viral load suppression, it's better quality of life for you. And you have a lower chance of transmitting the virus. It's not to say that if you have a lower viral load suppression that you have unprotected sex, just to be clear about that. But, Ethiopia, for example, there are a lot of countries that are at that like 60% mark or so. I mean, Ethiopia is at like a 71% mark for people who actually know that they're HIV positive.
71%.
Right.
So that's the first
71% of people who are HIV positive know that they're HIV positive. And we're trying to get Ethiopia to 90%. But compared to countries that are still at the 50-something% mark.
So if you're if someone's listening to this show, how can somebody go about finding out their HIV's, their status?
Right. So you can.
Is it scary? Is there any?
Not at all.
Okay.
It is not at all scary. I mean, I am terrified of needles, and when I say terrified, you know, even a tiny prick. To draw blood.
No tattoos for you.
No, and that is the reason why I mean, I can't even get a second earring hole because I'm that terrified of needles, right? So, you know, it is really not that scary. It is as it can be as simple as, you know, getting as it being part of your panel of tests when you do your annual doctor's visit. They can test for HIV. So the same blood that's drawn to test for other things can be used to test for HIV. That's one. You can do an oral swab. So if you don't want to be pricked, you can do an oral swab. And it doesn't take a lot of time.
Where can they get this? So let's say somebody's listening and they think, man, you know, I concerned, and I want to find this out once and for all. Is there a place that you would recommend? Are there clinics in Ethiopia?
Sure. So almost every clinic in Ethiopia will offer an HIV test. Almost every clinic, but every major hospital. Mm-hmm. So whether it's, you know, Black Lion Hospital, you can get an HIV test. At private clinics, you can get an HIV test. So particularly if you feel you're at risk. So if you had unprotected sex, if you feel you were exposed in some other fashion. So if you're if you know someone who's HIV positive and your blood, you know, somehow you had an open wound and their blood happened to come in contact with yours, you know, please go get tested. It's important to know your status. And, you know, it's understandable because, you know, when to know your status means you have to take action. And some people say, you know, well, if I know if I'm HIV positive, then, you know, the stigma and then the burden of and so on. And I say, well, the other alternative is becoming sick with this disease and dying from a disease that you can absolutely live with. You know, so that is really the only other option you have.
I want to back up and I want to make for people listening. I had my boot on the chair where the recorder is. So I just want to make. Hopefully, you don't hear my foot moving around. So I just moved my foot. Yes. So no, you said something that was really interesting. I mean, interesting in a shocking way.
Sure.
That the rate of prevalence, not to pick on any one country, but you mentioned regionally, like in the southern part of Africa, that the rates are you mentioned 25% in one place, and that's shocking. Is there? So what is it? Why? Why are some places controlling it better than others?
Yeah, and I think what happened was that at the onset of the disease, you saw this. You saw these huge rates in the southern part. I mean, a lot of it is around, you know, behavior. A lot around just a delay in catching on with the various interventions. And then in some other countries, so Senegal is a fantastic example. At the onset of the HIV crisis, I think Senegal's prevalence was somewhere around 1.4% or something like that. And it took leadership. So their government took it upon themselves to really put policies in place and to really have a very aggressive response. So Senegal has a prevalence rate of about 0.3%. And so you begin to see that, you know, in some countries, yes, there's certain behaviors, some certain risky behaviors that are more common or more prevalent or more actively practiced in certain parts of the continent or of the world. I mean, if you look at Central Asia, their epidemic is a bit different. It's, you know, some of it is primarily because of injection drug users, but in the African context, we see mostly, heterosexual transmission, mother-to-child transmission, and for some countries there was just a delay in if you will, calming the virus. So there are several factors, and in some countries there was denial, right? So we know that that there was this time. I can't remember exactly what year, but it was certainly in the early mid 2000s when Thabo Mbeki made this declaration. HIV doesn't cause AIDS. There are all these other factors. Some of that was definitely taken out of context. But then when you hear your leader say that, it kind of gives you free reign.
It's reassuring. It's certainly reassuring.
Right.
But...
So you're, so you just, and then. And then some societies, I think, even to talk about condom use, it takes a lot to talk about condom use. It takes a lot to talk about condom use, particularly in a younger population. There are some studies which show that if you delay the onset of of the first sexual experience, you have a lesser chance of contracting HIV. I mean, there are other confounding factors, but how do you tell a parent to have a conversation with their 15-year-old daughter about condoms at that time? I think now it's a lot better. And how do you convince schools to teach sex education to 12-year-olds and 13-year-olds? And I mean, I think it is just very, very difficult to put certain interventions or certain practices in place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on parenthood by any stretch of the imagination, but yeah, I mean, I feel like if you have to have that first conversation when you find something out, like that's probably too late.
Yes, absolutely. No, absolutely. Absolutely.
Whether that be for drugs, whether that be for sexual behavior, whether it be for I mean, like I want to have had that conversation with my son before he shows up at a party and somebody wants to give him drugs. Like he needs to have thought about what he's going to do in that neighborhood.
Yeah.
So,
no, Chris, you're absolutely right, and I think even at the time, and even now, and this is I think anywhere in the world, even in the U.S., right? It's also equipping parents with those tools. I have very young nieces and nephews, and I think just because of my line of work, I'm very open with them. So, we call private parts the exact same name. I don't call it anything different. And we have those conversations and we talk about, I talked about condoms when they were about 13 years old. Not necessarily because I think they're going to be sexually active, but they should know. They should know all these things. Just like what you said, I don't want them to come when they're 5 months pregnant and then I say, oh, I should have told you this is what and you hope and pray that that's not the path that they choose, but you're not with them 24/7 either.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
there's a lot of dangerous things in this world.
Absolutely.
And okay, off my high horse, PEPFAR helps. What does PEPFAR do? So PEPFAR, you mentioned government leadership.
Yes.
And I wanted to get a little bit into what do governments do, the successful governments, what does that leadership look like, and how does PEPFAR help
with that?
People help their citizens?
Sure. So the way PEPFAR is structured in almost every country is that, just as in Ethiopia, we sit in the U.S. Embassy, and we have several U.S. agencies that receive funding from PEPFAR. So if we take Ethiopia as an example, our current budget is $101 million. And that's basically, I shouldn't say shared, but divided or allocated to other U.S. agencies. So this USAID, CDC, which is the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the Department of Defense, and then the State Department, and PEPFAR falls under the State Department. And so those agencies in turn have implementing partners. And so we first of all set up our strategy, and the strategy is set in collaboration with the government. So this is a discussion with the government. We look at the available data to determine, how successful have we been, where are the gaps, and then there's a conversation with the government to then determine, okay, what are the priorities? And then we have internal discussions as well to determine which of those priorities can we support. And then once we do that, there are funding announcements that go out, and we have implementing partners who respond. Luckily, a lot of those agreements are over a 5-year period. And the other good thing, not to focus only on Ethiopia, but this also happens in other countries, is that the majority of that funding actually goes directly to government institutions. So whether it's a regional health bureau, whether it's directly to a Ministry of Health or an AIDS control program, and so on. And so our activities that we support are in I'll say maybe 3 buckets, and then we have cross-cutting activities. So these are they're prevention activities. How do we prevent transmission of HIV, and how do we find people who are living with HIV? So whether this is through programs with commercial sex workers, designing strategies that target commercial sex workers, ensuring that they are protected, ensuring that they're not transmitting the virus. It could also be core strategies that target adolescent girls and young women, strategies that target orphans and vulnerable children and their caregivers as well. So all of those things fall within our prevention package. And then within the care and treatment package, so this is PEPFAR globally and what happens. So we have a care and treatment package, and so this is for persons who are now on treatment. How do we ensure they have access to treatment? When they are already on treatment, how do we ensure that they have all those other services that are necessary for them to stay on treatment? So some of this might be food and nutrition, sustenance, and so on. And then we have these cross-cutting activities which kind of fall under our bucket of health system strengthening. In the beginning of PEPFAR in 2003 and in its full first phase, from 2003 to 2008, we did a lot of construction. So we built health centers, we built labs, we did a whole lot of that, trained healthcare workers. And over time, we've kind of phased out of doing that and really focus now on, renovation, training healthcare workers, making sure there are lab systems available, making sure there's data available, and also making sure that the supply chain system is working. Because if you don't have a working supply chain system, you cannot get medicine distributed to those who need it. So that's basically how we work. And all of this can only happen if the government is by our side, or the government is leading some of these things.
Can you talk a little bit about government leadership?
Sure.
What are some examples? You mentioned Senegal. What concrete steps have governments taken that have been effective in working with PEPFAR?
So I'll go back to my past life in Ghana, for example. So I used to support PEPFAR in Ghana. And one of the things that the Ghanaian government did was, so in Ghana, for example, PEPFAR's budget does not include purchase of ARVs and the drugs for HIV, so antiretroviral therapy. And, the government of Ghana was very aggressive, I would say, and in a very good, in a good way, not aggressive, not being bad, in really working with donors to highlight the need to increase the number of drugs that were coming into the country for their population. So where we worked with them is that we established a memorandum of agreement. We knew that we could find the funding to cover a certain period of time. And on the Ghanaian government side, their guarantee was to ensure that as we're talking about sustainability, so their guarantee was to ensure that they work with us to build a program that is sustainable, so that when PEPFAR funding is no longer available, those systems that we've put in place will be now embedded in the government structures, and that the government will be able to fully take over those activities that we support. So that's one example. There are other examples where the government sets the guidelines that we follow, and that's definitely more common in most countries. So whether it's how are we going to address interventions with commercial sex workers, the government sets those guidelines. A lot of times working closely with WHO. How are we going to address interventions for persons who are not compliant? How are we going to address, different treatment regimens? The government sets those guidelines. And even in how do we engage civil society? In some countries, we do that with the government. So the government kind of sets the tone and underlines the importance of this coordination or collaboration with civil society. So there's a wide range from like the technical space to the political space even. And sometimes it's something as simple as the Minister of Health making an appearance at an event on HIV and giving opening remarks. That already shows, the critical importance of that program to whether it's, the lay person or whether it's other persons within the government. And so people deem that to be important, and they will implement, whatever the interventions are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned something before we went on live for the recording about public-private partnerships.
Yes.
So that's a little different than partnering with the government.
Yes.
What can you give some examples of successful public-private partnerships?
Sure. So PEPFAR has two big ones. There are more than two, but those are the two big ones. So there's one I talked a little bit earlier about adolescent girls and young women. So as we have been growing, we've realized, and we start looking at the nature of the epidemic within different age groups and within so age and sex. Women, adolescent girls and young women in particular, were lagging behind. So we decided globally to come up with a set of core interventions to address the epidemic in adolescent girls and young women. And so what we did was so PEPFAR partnered with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and with Johnson & Johnson, and they funded this program that was implemented 2 years ago. And it's very, very focused on interventions for this age group. Then a second one that was just announced at the International AIDS Society Conference in July. It's called MenStar. And, unfortunately, our men tend to not access health services as much as women do.
What?
Yes, Chris.
I can't believe it. I don't know what is this crazy stuff that you're talking about?
This crazy thing I'm making up. I'm just making this up. I'm making this up. But they don't. I mean, I
totally want to be lectured about all my bad habits. Okay.
Or maybe they don't get sick.
Well,
maybe they don't get sick, or they think they don't get sick.
We have no pains.
Exactly.
We never get sick.
Yes, they have absolutely no issues. So there's no hospitals and clinics are made for women, not for men. Yes.
Just tough it out.
There you go.
Take a shot of whiskey, just to work through
and
this.
And it works itself out. So it's really a program to ensure that care and treatment services in particular are reaching men. And so this one is a partnership that was just launched. The details of it have not been ironed out yet. And I believe this is also with Johnson & Johnson. So part of, and this is part of PEPFAR's effort to ensure that everyone has a shared responsibility. So this is not only the responsibility of the government, it's not only the responsibility of civil society or persons who are HIV positive, it is the responsibility of private sector as well. I mean, we access their services, we pay for those services. It is their responsibility, and part of their workforce, particularly as people live longer with the disease, will include persons who are HIV positive. The branch into public-private partnerships is, really popular. We also partner with, manufacturers such as like Becton Dickinson. They're big in lab. And so those are some of the other types of public-private partnerships.
Okay. Well, what is this? You wouldn't say it's you still work with governments. It's not
Yes.
that like the public-private partnerships are taking over. But
No.
But-
So they provide the funding.
Mhm.
Yes, so
Okay.
they provide the funding, and in some cases they'll provide matching funds. So when I supported DRC, for example, we had a public-private partnership with Becton Dickinson, and so for every dollar that PEPFAR invested in the lab, they matched it 3 times.
wow.
So that also freed up funds for us to, focus on other interventions. Yes, so they solely provide funding.
This is a little bit of an aside. This is kind of the kind of thing I think a lot of our exchange folks, people who participate in U.S. government-funded exchanges, when they go to the United States, the United States is sort of known to not have sort of the public infrastructure that some of the other developed countries, Western European countries, for example, have. But what strikes a lot of our people who go on these exchanges is to see the level of private support and the level of charity and this, organizations and corporations and foundations. There's all this. Not to say that there isn't a political argument to have about what we should have or shouldn't have in the United States on the public sector, but I think that's corporate responsibility is big in the United
And
States.
it is important.
Yes, and it's very important. And I think, thankfully, it's also becoming important on this continent. I mean, you see like Dangote, he's doing a lot in that section. You start seeing other foundations like the Nelson Mandela Foundation. So it's slow, but it's coming, yes. And it's also understanding, I think, I'm not an economist by any, but I think it's also
Good, I wouldn't have you on the show if you
not an economist, not a
true.
politician,
Not true.
none of that. But I suspect that the slow growth is also just, like I mentioned, I'm originally from Cameroon. I think embedded in our African culture, you help anyway. Whether it's your neighbor's daughter's cousin's best friend who is in need, somehow you could be in a situation where that person starts living with your family and you're helping them, and before you know it, you're putting them through university and so on and so forth. So I think because there's that culture of, I think that corporate social responsibility took a long time to catch on, but I think people see the benefit of it. I mean, it's done so much, particularly in education. I don't think it's as popular I don't think it's as popular yet in health, but particularly in education.
I want to talk a little more uncomfortable subject. You mentioned some of the successes. You mentioned
Sure.
the way that governments and private partnerships are helping and in reduce. How would you describe the success? What success is? What reduced?
Reduced.
What are the way you think about it?
We think of it in maybe more than two, but maybe the one I'll highlight is in terms of results. I think our results are probably the biggest, and so we look at how many lives we've saved over a period of time.
Do you have an estimate on that?
Yes, so we know, for example, starting with just number of people that we've put on treatment. So when we first, at the beginning of PEPFAR, I think it was like 50,000 people that were on treatment, and now we support 14 million people globally on treatment. So those are 14 million people who could have died without, life-saving treatment, right? And then, one of our flagship programs has always been, prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. Because we really do believe if you do prevent that transmission, you can have an AIDS-free generation. And so throughout the years, because of that program, there are about 2 million babies that have been born HIV-free. So their mothers are infected.
How is that prevented?
So they are put on treatment while they're pregnant.
Interesting. To suppress
Yes, to suppress the virus.
Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay.
So the transmission to the baby is really is prevented. And after the baby is born, there's of course a lot of monitoring that's done between of mother-baby pairs rather, to ensure that there is no trace of the virus in the baby. And then, our other program that we really are proud of is, the attention to orphans and vulnerable children. So, of course, when in the middle of the HIV crisis, a lot of people died of AIDS, a lot of parents, so there were a ton of orphans. And by congressional mandate, 10% of each country's PEPFAR budget has to go towards orphans and vulnerable children. Wow. So regardless of what your budget could be $1 million, 10% of that still has to go to orphans and vulnerable children. One, because they are also at risk. Two, because there's some social needs that they no longer have because they don't have their parents. So we measure success in that way. We also measure success, this is not a popular one, I think, among countries, but we do measure success based on, a reduction in funding. For a lot of countries, reduction in funding is based on how well you're doing. So if you're getting closer and closer to epidemic control, and as a government, if you're able to take over the response or pieces of the response, it shows some kind of success because it shows a transfer in capacity to the country. So those are the two that I would highlight. Yeah.
What about failures?
We have not failed at anything, Chris. What do you mean failures? Is it a failure or a challenge? Can I say challenge, Chris?
Say challenge.
I don't like failure. I think one of the biggest challenges that faces PEPFAR is sustainability. I mean, there is no lie that it is an expensive program. It's from the type of interventions that are introduced,
And we're sort of out of the emergency phase.
And we're out of the emergency phase, right?
When it first started, it was a real crisis.
Exactly.
Not to say that it's...
Yes, no, you're right. You're absolutely right. And we were trying to do everything we could possibly do to stop it. And so now discussing sustainability, so you can imagine that, in the beginning we wanted to do everything possible. There was $80 billion, all this, not $80 billion then, but there's so much money available and, you could build and you could do all these things. And then now so there are a lot of governments that knew that their HIV program even will be fully funded under PEPFAR. So this is their own host country program will be funded by PEPFAR, or, staff will be funded by PEPFAR. And then now to all of a sudden ask a government that has so many priorities and maybe has, debt and so on to say, now you need to take over this $50 million annually $50 million program. It's a huge ask. So I think that will be, and has already become, and we see it, a huge challenge for PEPFAR. Because the fear is, if you don't provide similar types of services and you don't have the ability to change those services depending on the nature of the epidemic, then you might regress. And we don't want to see that regression. And so the challenge is, how do you make sure that, one, funding is available, two, the country is able to have, basic infrastructure or basic, guidelines in place that ensure that there will be no regression. I think that's a massive challenge. I mean, a lot of countries are looking at domestic resource mobilization options, and and that's tough. It's really difficult. One of the other largest donors, just so I can mention, is the Global Fund. And this is the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria. The U.S. government contributes about $5.1 billion to their budget. So about 30% of the Global Fund's budget is from the U.S. government. And, the Global Fund in its programming always asks governments to put in a certain percent of co-financing. A lot of countries cannot even afford that. So if countries cannot even afford, whether it's 1% or 5% of co-financing, how are they going to pick up an entire PEPFAR portfolio? I think that's one of the biggest challenges, which if we don't address and overcome, then you might actually have very good interventions fail.
How do we go about meeting those challenges?
Yeah, so I don't know that anyone has a clear answer. I don't. I think that this is one of those, it's quite sensitive. And I think, what I would say, and that's what we're trying to do in Ethiopia right now, is to have those conversations with the government now. And to really be clear about, the trajectory, being clear about the expectation for domestic resource mobilization and looking at other options. I think those conversations have to happen now. And also
they're happening all over the continent.
Right. And also trying to, maybe give very practical examples of how, resources can be reallocated. So domestic resources can be reallocated, or where additional resources can come from. Like Zimbabwe does, I think it's a 1% tax on, now I don't remember if it's tourism or something, but there's a 1% tax on something that goes into an HIV/AIDS fund.
Interesting.
So those are some examples, whether it's, maybe this push for public-private partnerships can be something that the government takes on. And, those could be focused on, HIV/AIDS, but also the risk is, and I think in general, even for some countries, looking at, this integration of HIV into the primary care system, because there are some countries that are at a certain point where that can happen. Because for as long as HIV is treated in its own silo, and then you have the primary care system, in some cases you find that you're, duplicating interventions. You're wasting resources. So, it's really finding where we can build efficiencies, but it's a very tough conversation to have.
Let me follow up on something you mentioned a little bit ago you mentioned something about the AIDS-free generation, which sounds really amazing.
I thought you were going to say unattainable.
No, why would I say something like that? The AIDS-free generation. So let's talk about a little bit about it. That sounds to me like it's something that people have thought about.
Yes.
And tell us where are we in attaining an AIDS-free generation?
Yeah. We're still a little bit far, but definitely closer than where. Yes, it's very aspirational for sure.
Got to have a goal.
And so, yes, so this is the term AIDS-free generation was really introduced by UNAIDS. This is the United Nations Joint Commission on AIDS, and the role of UNAIDS, if I can digress for just a little bit, UNAIDS is the convener. They are the ones that set the tone globally. And then the rest of us follow those strategies that they put in place. So they truly believe, and we agree, that we can have an AIDS-free generation. And so we're hoping that we get to that point in some countries, at least in 2030. And one of the ways that we can get there, I've mentioned prevention of mother-to-child transmission of HIV. That's a way to get to an AIDS-free generation. We can at least have one generation that's born AIDS-free. And so hopefully we see that in 2030. It also ties into UNAIDS fast track strategy. So this is the 1990 strategy that I mentioned before. So if we monitor it by ensuring that people know their status and on treatment, you can reduce transmission rates. So you're not able, there'll be fewer transmissions to, let's say from a man to a woman who then gets pregnant and so on and so forth. So, I personally think it's possible. It's very ambitious. It requires a lot of commitment from government. It requires, funding, and it really requires us to think beyond realistic goals. I think that's the challenge. Why not?
There's been smallpox.
Yes.
There's been precedents that
that
humanity has done away with.
Yes.
Granted, those are vaccinations, but still, there have been examples. There has been a precedent of totally removing.
Yes. No, you're absolutely right.
And this is one of the things that, as non-American, I appreciate the PEPFAR genesis, because the U.S. government didn't say that this is a problem, yes, for everyone, but it's a problem for me too.
Yes.
So I'm taking care of mine.
Yeah.
But then again, everyone else should. The solidarity and the reaching out, and at some point when we do get to the AIDS-free generation. Imagine the role PEPFAR would have played. So
no, absolutely.
I give credit to PEPFAR for a very...
Absolutely. And even think of where we were just 15 years ago.
Absolutely.
So there are 15 and 16-year-old people who were born at that time. And at the time it was like, what? You're HIV positive? Oh my God, no, you're dying tomorrow.
Yes.
And so within that short span of their life, you can actually, it's, when you think about it that way, within that short span, you can say, oh, you're HIV positive. Well, there are drugs you can take. These are the things you can do. You can still have an active lifestyle. You can still have a social life. You can work out. You can eat.
The narrative has really changed.
Yes, you can hang out. You can travel. You can, there are all these things you can do. It's not a death sentence. It doesn't mean you go home and crawl under your blanket and wait for death. They're within 15 years. So that's why I think, yes, an AIDS-free generation is possible. Yes.
And I don't know, maybe this conversation was back in the 80s in the U.S., so you guys might not remember this, but for us in Africa, it was very recent history. And people were stigmatized. Whole communities just, did not speak or include people with HIV or AIDS into their midst. And this has completely changed in the past few years. It's really amazing to actually see the change. It happened. I have no words to,
no, absolutely. And stigma is still there, right?
Yes,
which we still have to work on. But it's not as bad as it was. Where, like you said, whole families are labeled. Like, oh yeah, their son is HIV positive. Do not go there. The minute you walk, onto their patio or verandas, we call it, you're done. You'll become it. So it's no...
By association too.
Yeah.
Well, Lolem,
yes.
Very nice to meet you, and farewell.
Thank you.
Really, I regret not having spoken to you before today. I've seen you around the embassy, and obviously you've been doing really good work, and you're going to continue to do great work.
Thank you, Chris.
PEPFAR is one of those sort of amazing stories of compassion and ingenuity and mobilization for partnership, and I'm very proud of that, and I'm not in a position to be proud of you, but thank you for everything you've been doing.
Thank you very much, Chris, and
wish
thank
you
you
the
for
best.
the interview. Thank you, and thank you, Cesar.
Thank you so much for the fruitful discussion. I actually learned a lot about PEPFAR, and of course about Africa, and of course Ethiopia as well. Very interesting things that you told us, and sure that another 15 years will continue for PEPFAR, and we will get to see much more of your organization's work.
Thank you. Thank you.
Seaside, very good interview today.
Yes.
And very nice to work with you, and we I look forward to having another episode with you.
Obviously, I'm sure you will have me. Well, that was Real Talk USA, and I'm sure that you guys enjoyed today's topic. We'll be back on another segment of the show with another interesting topic. Just don't forget to tune your radio same time next week for Real Talk USA.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Real Talk USA.
It's my house, come on.